Welcome to Conversations with Crosswinds Counseling. I'm your host, Curtis Smith. Every week on this podcast, we talk about all things mental health, sometimes stress or anxiety. Perhaps you're burned out. Well, this is the podcast for you. We sit down with the wonderful counselors at Crosswinds Counseling and have a great conversation every week. Let's dive into this week's episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Conversations with Crosswinds Counseling. I'm your host, Curtis Smith. We are joined by Grant Anderson today. Grant is the clinical manager for Crosswinds Counseling in Indianapolis. Grant, thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And today we are talking about a common topic, grief, but specifically looking at it in childhood and the different stages of childhood and how grief will play out. So, Grant, first off, big picture thoughts. Grief is something that we all go through at some point.
Right.
Even as adults, it can be hard to process.
Right.
How do kids process grief? How do we help them handle that?
They definitely will process it at different developmental stages. And so what we're seeing is really before the age of 6, really 0 to 5, we're not seeing an that of grief at all. They may have words, but they're not really understanding the finality of it. It really starts at about age 6, where they begin to understand that death is final. They may not always be able to put into picture what that means. It's really about 10 years old that they begin to understand that this will one day happen to me, and it's very far in the future. And that changes just the way they can think about grief in general.
Well, let's start with some of the younger ages then. Obviously, the younger you get, the less you have to address it with them. You don't need to talk to a 3-month-old about grief. But a 3 or 4-year-old, they may not have the brain function to process it well, but they know something has happened. So how do you help them, certainly with death, but even if they're going through grief that comes from something that's not death?
Yeah. And because we definitely know that, not all grief is just death related. It can be the experience, the loss of something. Parents divorcing can be a grief experience for that child.
Yeah.
And so one of the biggest ways that I think, especially at that young age, before they really have a good emotional identification and understand what's going on inside of them, is just modeling how parents are handling the grief or how they're handling whatever they're going through is going to be a big impact on how that child sees and how they feel safe or unsafe going through that grief process.
Let's move up that 6 to 10 range where they have enough brain ability to understand some of what's happening. They might not fully grasp it, but in those stages, in those years where they're able to understand death, understand finality of things, understand how maybe they're even feeling, how do you dive in deeper, but keep in mind that it's still a 6 to 10-year-old?
Right. And so really the research shows about 6 to 12. So what they're noticing is sometimes they don't have the true emotional understanding of what's going on. They know that something final has happened. What we do see is it may come out in more physical ailments. They may say that they have a stomach ache or their head hurts. So the caregiver to really be aware of the actions and reactions is very big on seeing how their child is responding to the grief.
That seems like it could be really tough. I mean, if a kid comes to you 6, 7, 8 years old and says, I have a stomach ache, I mean, your first reaction is probably to think, well, they actually have a stomach ache. It's a physical thing. It was born out of some food or something they ate or drank or something. And maybe to try to figure out the differentiator there between something physical and something mental and emotional, that's got to be tricky.
And that's absolutely true. I'd say a big piece of that is really helping them begin to try to process if there's a feeling behind the physical ailment. And that just because they might struggle with an emotional identification doesn't mean you can't walk them through some actionable things that can help with emotions, like listening to music or doing a sand tray or doing some artwork can help process internal emotions in a physical manner. Yeah,
that makes sense. Let's talk about the next phase as you get into the teenage years, maybe starting at 12, it sounds like. Obviously, at that point, you've got, generally speaking, plenty of brain function to understand grief, understand death, and the finality of it. But the teenage years come with so much more anyway, outside of grief, just in normal circumstances. How do you then help that next age group of kids when they're dealing with grief?
Yeah, it's absolutely a very complicated issue because that teenager is seeing themselves as an adult at this point, even though that developmentally they're not a child, but they're not yet an adult. So they're already kind of in the clockwork is continuing to move them forward, but when grief happens, they can't stop the clock and deal with it. They continue to move forward in that piece, and so they might have some emotional identification, but they're really struggling between those two worlds of child and adult. And what that means is there might be a fear because of what we see with teenagers is what's called an invulnerability complex, so that I'm invulnerable, nothing can touch me, and so they hold on to that. And so when there's grief, it's I don't want to necessarily ask for help or show that I need help because that makes me childlike, and I'm not a child anymore. So they make me struggle to go to caregivers or to adults. They may struggle to go to peers because of the same reason. I don't want to look weak in front of my peers. So they tend to want to deal with grief on their own very internally, and that can lead to a lot of complicated grief issues.
In terms of looking at the age classifications, does that basically take us to 18? Is 12 to 18 kind of lumped together?
13 to 18 is what they're looking at there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Something that just comes to mind here is even as adults, a lot of us grieve differently. So even if you're 30, 40, 50 years old and you're intelligent and a high-functioning adult and you've kind of got it all together and something comes into your life that causes you grief, that might look like one thing for me. It might look like something completely different for you and something completely different for a third person. So that strikes me as something that makes it very tricky to identify in kids because kids have to be the same way. So we're lumping them together age-wise, and I get that, but it's hard to lump them together personality-wise because as humans, we all react a little bit differently. So as you dig into it with a kid, a long setup to the question, which is as you dig into it with a kid, how do you help understand, they're going to process grief this way. No, they're going to process it this way. What's that work look like?
From a caregiver or from a parent or someone who's coming alongside them as an adult, the big thing is showing availability, making sure they know that you're there for them and you want to support them through this. A child just knowing, even if they don't necessarily want to come to an adult, knowing that the adult's there can have a huge impact on their ability to process through that grief.
Yeah, let me ask about that because a lot of us as adults, when we do go through grief, we don't want to be with other people. We'd like a little isolation. We'd like to kind of retreat from the world. If a kid is naturally wired that way, it's still important to show that you're available, though.
Absolutely. And giving them other outlets, too, that are not just connecting wise or communication. It can be journaling, it can be art, it can be music, just as helpful in the teenage years as the younger years as well.
What about the adult who's grieving themselves, trying to provide support and love and care for a child who's grieving? Boy, that just feels like a tremendous challenge. From a clinical standpoint, what do those challenges look like, and how do they play out?
It absolutely is its own challenge in itself. Is you're going through your own grief, and yet you're trying to model going through grief in a healthy way. But sometimes that's the first time that adult has gone through grief, and so they're trying to figure out how to do it right because they want their child to see how to do it right. And so it could add a lot of performance issues to them of how do I model grief well when I'm struggling to model grief in myself well. I think it's definitely times to reach out and get help, support. When you're going through that, it's helpful not to have to go through it alone.
Child or adult, teenager, wherever people are on the spectrum, counseling is always a good option in grief, right?
Yep. I would agree with that.
Yeah, great. Closing thoughts here, Grant, about grief, especially grief in children. Anything else that you would add for our audience today?
Yeah, I think you hinted on it, and that is that grief is not going to look the same in every single person. It's always going to be unique, and we all grieve in our own way. And don't get so caught up in, well, you're not talking about this, you're not talking about that. You should be if you're grieving. We all will grieve a little bit differently. The important piece is that when we're grieving, we're moving through the process and we're moving forward. And that's really what you're looking for, whether it's a child, a teenager, or an adult.
Good stuff. Grant, thank you so much. If you are dealing with grief and you feel like counseling could be a good option for you, Crosswinds Counseling is always a great option when you're looking for counselors. You can go to crosswindscounseling.org to find a counselor in Fort Wayne and Indianapolis. We have virtual options as well, so always a good thing to check us out there. Thanks for joining us on the podcast. We will see you next time. Thanks for watching Conversations with Crosswinds Counseling today. Don't forget to like and subscribe to get more of our podcast. And you can comment in the section below. Perhaps you could share what you'd like us to discuss in future episodes. We've got new episodes coming out every week. So we'll see you next time on Conversations with Crosswinds Counseling.